DX is proud to be supported by AMBOSS, a medical education platform with an expansive resource library and USMLE-style question bank. Hello and welcome to 10 Clinical Minutes from Decoding DX. I'm Brianna, newly minted MD as of this weekend. Today we're going to be talking about some random EKG pearls that I've accumulated throughout my training and I found either useful or just kind of fun to know. So to start out, to make sense of a lot of the EKG findings that I'm going to talk about, it really does rely on a base understanding of the orientation of EKG leads. So in general, from a basic level, a positive signal on the EKG means that electricity is moving toward the lead that you're looking at, whereas a negative signal on the EKG means the electricity is moving away from that lead. So for example, let's look at the atria. P waves are indicative of atrial depolarization. So if we take these arrows to mean the movement of electricity for atrial depolarization, that P wave is going to be positive in lead 1 because lead 1 is over here and it's detecting the electrical movement from this right side of the heart over to the left side of the heart. On the other hand, AVR is on the right side of the body. And so it's going to see this electrical movement in the opposite direction, and it's going to interpret that as a negative signal. Lead placement is also important to know. So the limb leads are leads 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVF, and AVL. A lot of the times in the emergency department and other places where they're doing EKGs, we don't actually put on all of these leads. Typically, lead 1 is put on the left arm, AVF is put on the left leg, and AVR is put on the right arm. The other leads are calculated from the electrophysics of the electricity. The precordial leads are put along the patient's chest, moving from right with V1 over to the left side with V6. So let's start off with some erratic baselines. Let's say you're given this EKG. What's your first thought? What's up with that baseline? Look particularly at lead 2 down here. It's a pretty erratic baseline. Some people would see this and say, hey, that looks like maybe some sawtooth or maybe a coarse fib. While that may be your first instinct, you need to look a little bit more carefully. This patient actually has Parkinson's disease, and the erratic baseline that you see is from their tremor. How do we tell the difference? Sometimes it's not super easy to tell the difference between a really coarse a-fib versus a tremor or some other interference. There's a couple different clues that you can rely on. First, look at the PR intervals and the RR intervals. See if they are consistent throughout. If they're regular, then it's probably not fib. Sometimes flutter can be regular, but look at that P wave morphology. If before every QRS you have an identical appearing P wave and a consistent PR interval, then that is more likely to be a sinus rhythm. Other clues that you can look for are to see if this quote-unquote arrhythmia or erratic baseline is appearing more in some leads as opposed to others. In this example, you can see that the coarse baseline is really prominent in lead 2, but not so much in lead 3 or in the precordials. It's pretty prominent up here in the other limb leads, but that's just an inconsistent pattern. So that is more consistent with an interference pattern. Whereas if this was a fib or a flutter, you would see that erratic baseline pattern on more of the leads throughout the EKG. Another thing you can look for is to see if the sinus beats will quote unquote march out despite the confusion going on in the background. In general, with all EKG type interpretation, this is a good sign of interference. Despite the erratic stuff that you're seeing, if you can identify good normal sinus beats that are going throughout in one of the leads, that's a good sign that something else is causing the erratic patterns that you're seeing in the other leads, and it's not actually an electrophysiology finding. Let's say now that you are on night floats and you are paged because of a non-sustained V-tach on tele. You go to the floor and you check the telemonitor, and this is what you see. So is this V-tach? Do we need to worry? Do we need to rush to the bedside, call a code? It never hurts to be cautious, never hurts to go to the bedside and check on the patient, but it will make your life easier as an intern and a resident to know the difference between V-tach and interference. In this case, this is a false alarm. This is not V-tach. This is just movement. The patient's probably just moving in their bed. One clue to this is that you can look at just the morphology of this pattern. This is really spiked and super erratic. That is much more likely to be interference as opposed to V-tach. Let's say you go to the unit and this is what you see on the monitor this time. This is non-sustained V-tach. The difference between sustained and non-sustained is 30 seconds. So non-sustained V-tach lasts less than 30 seconds, whereas sustained V-tach lasts for more than 30 seconds. How do we tell the difference between this and the artifact that we saw in the previous example? Well, if you look at the morphology here, you can see that it's a lot smoother and the pattern is a little bit more regular. You can also look for a PVC or premature ventricular complex at the beginning of the episode that will trigger it. Oftentimes, this PVC comes very quickly after a T wave in the previous beat. This is called the R on T phenomena and often happens as the triggering event to a V-tach episode. The management of non-sustained V-tach is a bit beyond our scope here, but in general, if the patient is pulseless, call a code, start ACLS. If they are hemodynamically unstable, call a rapid. Think about synchronized cardioversion, get pads on the chest, and do other supportive measures like oxygen, IV fluids, that type of thing. If they are hemodynamically stable, which is typically the case with non-sustained V-tach, the management's a little controversial. You definitely want to check their med list for any QT prolonging meds because that can trigger the R&T phenomena. If this is new or they're symptomatic, you definitely want to consult cardiology and see if there's something that they can help you manage or figure out. And just in general, the reason that we worry about V-tach is because it can decompensate into v-fib, which is an extremely unstable rhythm. All right, let's get another example. You're on night float, you're called because of V-tach on the tele alarm, and this is what you see on the floor. What do? This is a false alarm. Huge helpful clue here. Look at all of the leads. During the event, look at lead 3. There's actually sinus beats with clear P waves, QRSs, and T waves during the event. So this is impossible if this was an actual arrhythmia event. It is impossible to have sinus beats in one lead and an event in another lead. So this tells you that the erratic stuff that you see in the other leads is interference, and this patient was not in V-tach. Here's our last one for this topic, I promise. You're called to bedside. This is what you see on the tele monitor. This is sustained V-tach. So this is lasting for longer than 30 seconds. You can't see it on this strip that I have, but trust me, it lasted longer than 30 seconds. And again, look for that PVC as a helpful clue to distinguish for when this V-tach episode started. If that PVC is there, that's a good indicator that this is true V-tach. Sustained V-tach is very concerning, very risky because, like I said earlier, it can quickly decompensate into v-fib. You need to be at the bedside, get pads on the patient's chest, be ready to start ALS, check meds for QT prolongation, and do not leave that patient's side until the rhythm is stabilized. Next up, I'm going to talk about lead 1 sign. This finding is much more academic than clinically helpful, but I still think it's fun. What we're looking at in this EKG is isolated low voltage in lead 1. This can commonly be seen in severe COPD. The reason for it is related to the right heart strain and the changes that happen to the heart secondary to the COPD. And other helpful clues that this is what you're seeing in the EKG is if you also see right axis deviation and RVH in the EKG at the same time. Next, we're going to talk about the little P wave that is small but mighty and can give you a lot of clues into stuff that's going on with your patient. Remember the atrial depolarization and the way that different leads will see it. Another thing to realize is that a P wave actually has 2 parts to it. The first part is the right atrium, and the last part is reflective of the left atrium. So let's say we have biphasic P waves in V1. What I mean by this is if you look, you can see that there's a positive blip to the P wave and then a negative blip to the P wave. So there's 2 different morphologies that are happening in this P wave. This is indicative of a left atrial abnormality, because that second half of the P wave, which indicates the left atrium, is abnormal. It's got a weird morphology. So there's something going on in the left atrium. This isn't specific to any particular abnormality, but it's telling you that there's something going on. When you see this on an EKG, consider the perspective of lead V1. What is V1 looking at? Especially if this abnormality is paired with something like a tall R wave in lead 1 or right ventricular hypertrophy, consider mitral stenosis. That's telling you that lead 1 is detecting more activity than it normally would. And so that can be indicative of right ventricular hypertrophy. And if you pair that with a left atrial abnormality, that can indicate mitral stenosis. So this is not diagnostic. You still need to get an echo, but it can help clue you in. Next up is broad P waves in lead 2. Look down at this P wave and see how wide this is. Normally, P waves are not that wide. So this is also indicative of a left atrial abnormality because that second part of the P wave is being extended, which is indicative of the left atrium. Think about lead 2 in the perspective of electricity that it is seeing. If the left atrium is dilated, it's going to take longer for that electrical signal in order to get all the way across the atrium and then be detected by the lead. So that's why you're seeing this prolonged P wave, because it takes a little bit longer for the electricity to get all the way through that big old dilated left atrium. Next up, if you have peaked P waves in lead 2, this is sometimes called P pulmonale, and this is typically indicative of right atrial enlargement because that beginning part of the P wave is reflective of the right atrium. So if the right atrium is enlarged, you're going to accentuate that start of the P wave. Here are some sources. After I started editing this episode, I realized that it had gotten pretty lengthy, so I went ahead and split it up into 2. So make sure to follow up with part 2 to get some more EKG pearls. If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please like and subscribe. It really does help our channel. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at info@decodingdx.com and visit our website, decodingdx.com, for past episodes, show notes, and to join our mailing list. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in part 2.